Okay, we're here to talk about one final answer to the question, why be moral? Now, this is not something that y'all read about. It's something that is in the Schaefer-Landau book, but it was not an assigned reading. However, we're going to consider it here very briefly. You don't have to read it, but for the sake of you just knowing about the position, I'm going to lecture just a little bit about it. So I did say that this was a third cynical answer to the question, why be moral? The first one was Glaucon's, your only reason to be moral is to avoid punishment or social disapproval, maybe. Second was Wolf's answer. She said, you don't have reason to be moral. You actually have reason to want not to be moral. And third, this answer to the question says we actually do have reason to be moral in every case, but it's only by redefining what morality is. So the why be moral question, the why be moral problem is a really hard problem because it does seem like what's good for us and what's moral diverge very often. That's what makes it a hard problem. And this last solution just says, well, we can solve this diverging if we just redefine morality so that it just kind of by definition parallels what's good for us. And that's not a good answer to the question. So we'll talk about that, and I'll briefly gesture at what might be some better, some less cynical answers to the question, and my camera will get super fuzzy. Okay, there we go. But none of the readings thus far gave a really good, what I would consider non-cynical answer to the question. So we're not going to talk about that in depth a lot. Part of the reason that that's not represented in the readings is, like I said, is a really hard question. This is a question that people have struggled with for thousands of years. It's something that no one has been able to give a really totally satisfying answer to. That's not to say that there are no good answers out there. And I'll hint at maybe a few of them. But we're going to spend most of our time, as we have already, on these more cynical answers to the question. Take that. If you, like me, think that the answer should be deeper and less cynical, there should be more of a deep connection to morality with our reason to be moral, then take this as a challenge. And if you want to talk about it, I'm happy to talk to you about it. Okay, so let me screen share with you. Okay, so we were talking about Wolf last. This is where we ended. So here's the theory that tries to redefine morality so that it fits well with our self-interest. It's just a theory called egoism. It says what you morally ought to do is whatever best promotes your self-interest. So the problem, you could conceive of the problem or the question, why be moral, as asking what kind of self-interest kind of reason do we have to be moral? Help me line up what's good for me and what's moral. And what many people have tried to do is say, oh, let me show you how the self-interest lines up with what you typically think to be moral. Let me show you how your self-interest isn't what you think it is. It's actually more in line with what's required by morality. Egoists take a different tack. They say, no, leave your self-interest exactly how it is. We don't have to redefine it or change it. I'm going to redefine morality so that it lines up with self-interest. So, I mean, more technically, you could say this: if you morally ought to do something, then it best promotes your self-interest. If it best promotes your self-interest, then you morally ought to do it. Now, you might be thinking, that's going to be a crazy theory because, it seems like we have lots of self-interest bound up in lots of immoral things, for example, right? Surely there are cases where someone has murdered someone out of self-interest. If, for example, that person is going to, rat you out and you're going to go to prison for the rest of your life, for sure. Maybe you have an opportunity to kill them and you have pretty good reason to think you won't be caught. It's kind of a win-win in terms of self-interest. You shouldn't do it, obviously, but in terms of self-interest, it's a win-win because if they live, you go into prison for forever. If you kill them, you might not go to prison for forever. So you might think, surely that it's in that person's self-interest to commit murder. And that seems morally horrendous. So how can this theory be true? Well, normally I'd love to say, let me show you some nuance to this theory, but I think that is ultimately the right sort of thought. I think this is sort of a dead end. We're talking about it because we need to fill out the conceptual space, so to speak. We need to talk about this as an option. It helps us to kind of figure out what the problem is, like, well, me doing my hands like this, right? So it helps us figure out what the problem is because it helps us to see that we've been trying to line self-interest up with morality. And there is the option, technically speaking, it's an option, it's a logically possible option of lining morality up so that it aligns with self-interest. But for all the reasons we just said, and we can spell it out here a little bit more, that's just not going to work, right? Unless you have some really crazy counterintuitive definition of our self-interest, this is going to entail that we ought to do things that we really clearly shouldn't do, right? And it's going to entail that we shouldn't do things that we clearly should do, right? I've got some cases here. I haven't really fully spelled them out. The first case I'm referring to is a case where you're walking by a pond. You see a kid drowning. You're the only one around. They're going to drown if you pass up. It's only going to cost you your shoes, which are worth like $40 or something like that. They're going to be ruined if you wade into the pond, and you got to wade into the pond because he's a few feet out. Should you help the kid in the pond? Are you morally required? Answer, obviously yes. If you don't, you're a horrible person. But unless you can tell me some kind of new, some kind of counterintuitive definition of self-interest, it looks like it's not in your interest, right? I mean, it's gonna destroy your shoes. And what do you get out of it? Let's assume you're not going to get anything out of it, and you can know that, right? Maybe it's an orphan or something like that. You're just going to hand them over to the state, and you're not going to get a reward, whatever. You're not even going to get your shoes paid for. You're going to be out at least several hours of your life, and the cost of your shoes and your wet feet. So it's not in your interest. So egoism would seem to entail that you have no obligation to do it. Maybe even that you have an obligation not to do it. Yeah, sorry. It does straightforwardly entail that you have an obligation not to do it. And that's just crazy. Similarly with murdering for political gain, or consider the murder case that I just gave. It seems like egoism says I have an obligation to commit that murder, and I clearly have an obligation not to commit that murder. So it's really hard to conceive of a crazier theory than egoism. We're considering it really just to kind of understand the problem, right? This is my reference to the problem now. And it also can't explain why my interests on egoism, my interests are so much more important than anyone else's. They're what define my moral obligations. But that just seems so wrong-headed. Morality seems to be about treating people impartially to some extent, right? That other people are just as important as I am, right? And so egoism seems to be about as far from a correct account of morality as you can get. So I think it's a failure as a response to the question. But even if you could come up with a theory of self-interest that didn't make it so crazy, that got you out of some of these problems, it still looks like a cynical answer to the question, because you still have to redefine morality to some extent to fit with our self-interest. Okay, so that's where we're going to end. Well, let me talk a little bit, kind of gesture at some theories that are, I think, less cynical theories. I'll point you in some directions. I don't have time to go into them, and we didn't do any reading on them, so I don't want to go into too much depth. One thing we could think about is to what extent morality really is deeply tied to being in society. It does seem to be really closely bound up with it. Like, morality does seem to be really essentially tied up with living with other people, right? Now, Kant and others think, and I think it's plausible, that we do have duties to ourselves that we would have independently of other people. Kant thinks you have a duty to develop your talents, to develop what you're good at naturally. And he thinks you actually are failing morally if you let them go undeveloped, right? If you just sit and eat chips all day, you're not just failing kind of personally, you're failing morally, he thinks. You can have duties to yourself. He also thinks you have a duty not to commit suicide. And that's just a pure duty to yourself. Even if no one else is depending on you, Kant thinks you have a duty not to commit suicide. That's just a duty to yourself. But at the same time, so many of our duties and our obligations and our virtues are bound up with other people. Think about the virtue of generosity. It's about helping other people. Think about the virtue even of courage, right? Courage is sometimes just about ourselves, but it's often, at least in its kind of classical context, courage in battle is about other people. You're courageous. One of my favorite moments in Lord of the Rings is in the third movie. It's in the books too, but think of the third movie, The Return of the King, when crap, I'm forgetting the female character's name, from Rohan, is on the horse with Merry, and she says, "Courage, Merry, courage for our friends." And there's just so much bound up in that one line that courage is not good in the abstract in this vision, or on this view of courage. It's good for the sake of someone else. They are being courageous for the sake of their friends that they have. It's not even just an impersonal stranger. It's their friends that courage is oriented towards. You are courageous for the sake of your friends. So much of that points to this kind of clue that maybe morality and living morally is essential to living in society, to living with other people, and to not just that, not like that makes it sound superficial, like having a next door neighbor or something, but really living in a deep community with people, right? That's something that's deeply good for us as humans. And if it turned out that morality really was essential to that enterprise, then we would have reason to be moral, right? Because being deeply social creatures, the kind of being that thrives in community and without community cannot live a good life, and I think that's true of us, then maybe we do have very strong reason to be moral. That's not just external, right? It's not just punishment based. So I'll leave you with that thought, and I don't want to go into too much more depth there, but that's just something to kind of go forward thinking about. And that is the last of our videos for this week. So I'll see y'all soon.